She had a security team of 12. She had cameras in every corner. She had the most expensive protection money could buy. And still, it was the maintenance man she laughed at who saved her life. Celeste Marlowe didn't see it coming. Not the threat, not the man, not the moment that would force her to stand in front of 200 people and admit she had been wrong about everything. This is the story of Gavin Rourke, a man who chose a toolbox over a career, a daughter over a title, and quiet dignity over the need to prove himself to anyone. If this kind of story moves you, hit that subscribe button right now, turn on notifications, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's get into it. The Ashford Crown Hotel didn't look like a place where ordinary people worked. It rose 34 floors above the downtown grid, like something that had been designed specifically to make people feel small. All dark glass and polished limestone, its entrance framed by brass fixtures that a team of staff cleaned by hand every single morning before 6 a.m. The lobby chandeliers alone were insured for more money than most people in the building would earn in a decade. The carpets were custom. The floral arrangements came from a florist in the Netherlands. The elevator buttons were real gold plate. And somewhere in the middle of all that manufactured splendor, on the 14th floor service corridor, a man named Gavin Rourke was on his knees replacing a section of copper pipe beneath a leaking utility sink. He wasn't thinking about the hotel's aesthetic. He wasn't thinking about the investor summit being set up 3 floors below him, or the billionaire who was scheduled to speak at it, or the catering staff currently moving through the service entrances in pressed white jackets. He was thinking about whether he'd remembered to sign Maisie's permission slip for the school field trip to the Natural History Museum. I was almost certain he'd left it on the kitchen counter. That was the kind of thing that occupied Gavin Rourke's mind on a Tuesday morning. He was 32 years old, which people often found surprising when they looked at him directly. There was something about the stillness in his face that read older, not tired exactly, but settled in a way that most men his age weren't. He had dark hair that he kept short without being precious about it, hands that were scarred across the knuckles from years of work that preceded hotel maintenance, and eyes that had a habit of scanning a room before he was consciously aware he was doing it. He stood at 6'1", but rarely seemed to take up much space. He'd learned a long time ago that visible presence was something you switched on and off depending on the situation. Right now, it was very much switched off. His uniform was gray, a shade that was probably intended to be charcoal when it was new but had faded to something more honest through commercial washing. His name was embroidered above the chest pocket in yellow thread. His toolbox was battered in the way that tools only get battered when they're actually used. He had a smear of pipe sealant on his left forearm that he hadn't noticed yet. He worked quietly. That was one of the things the hotel's facilities manager, a heavy-set man named Don Prewitt, genuinely appreciated about Gavin. Some maintenance workers narrated their own repairs. They sighed loudly at problems. They cataloged their own suffering. Gavin just fixed things. You gave him a work order and the work got done, and he didn't need you to acknowledge how difficult it had been. He'd been working at the Ashford Crown for 3 years. Before that, before the toolbox and the faded uniform and the permission slips, he'd done something else entirely. But that was a different chapter, and Gavin had closed it deliberately, with both hands, the way you close a door in a house you're leaving for good. Maisie had turned 7 in March. She had her mother's jawline and Gavin's eyes, which was a combination that struck him sometimes as almost unfairly poignant. She was in 2nd grade at Jefferson Elementary, 11 minutes from their apartment by the route Gavin drove, 9 minutes by the faster one that had the badly timed traffic light. She liked dinosaurs, specifically the kind that were now believed to have had feathers, which she considered a personal betrayal by evolution, and she was currently learning to read chapter books. And she had recently decided that her stuffed elephant named Gerald was too old to sleep with her and had placed him on the bookshelf facing the wall, which Gavin suspected had more to do with a conversation she'd overheard from an older girl at school than any genuine developmental shift. He knew his daughter the way you only know someone when they are your whole world. Maisie's mother, Dana, had died 22 months after Maisie was born. An arteriovenous malformation, a tangle of blood vessels in her brain that nobody had known was there. One morning, she'd woken up with a headache. 4 days later, she was gone. Gavin had been 31 days into a protection detail in Zurich when the call came. He'd caught the first flight back, and he'd never taken another professional assignment after that. Some people told him that was an overreaction, that he could have made it work. Hired help, au pairs, a nanny. He'd had the income for it. He'd had the career trajectory. But he'd grown up with a father who was technically present and practically absent, and he'd made a decision at his wife's funeral that he was going to be every version of present that a father could be, even if it meant walking away from the work he was genuinely good at. Even if people who knew what he'd done raised their eyebrows at his uniform, he'd made his peace with it, most days. The call came down at 8:17. Don Prewitt's voice crackled through the small two-way radio clipped to Gavin's belt. "Rourke, when you're done with 14, I need you on the event floor, VIP corridor near the Meridian Ballroom. They're setting up for the summit, and one of the wall-mounted display panels is flickering. Marlowe's people called it in. Apparently it's distracting." Gavin pressed the radio. "Copy that. 15 minutes." He finished the pipe repair in 12, cleaned up, and took the service elevator down to the 11th floor. The Meridian Ballroom was the hotel's largest event space, capable of seating 300, expandable to 450, with the movable partition walls opened. For the Ashford Summit on Emerging Markets, it had been configured for approximately 220, rows of cushioned chairs, a raised stage at the far end, and display panels along both side walls cycling through sponsor logos and event branding. The one Gavin needed to check was the third panel from the stage on the east wall, flickering intermittently in a way that suggested either a loose signal cable or a failing power connection. The corridor outside the ballroom was busy in the contained, purposeful way of event preparation. Catering staff moved through in clusters carrying linen, glassware, and trays. AV technicians rolled cable drums. A woman with a headset and a clipboard moved through everyone with the expression of a person who had been managing other people's crises for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like not to. Gavin found his way to the panel, opened the service panel beneath it, and started checking connections. He was there for about 4 minutes before he heard her. The voice arrived before she did, clear and carrying, the kind of voice produced by a lifetime of being listened to. "And I want the stage lighting rechecked before noon because what I saw in the monitor feed was completely unacceptable. Also, somebody needs to confirm the interpreter is actually in the building and not just confirmed on paper." Gavin didn't look up. Footsteps, then a pause in his general vicinity. "Is this corridor supposed to be clear?" A different voice now, male, clipped, professionally cautious. "I thought we requested a maintenance-free window from 8 to 12. "It's a flickering display panel," the woman with the headset said somewhere behind Gavin. "We needed it handled. Can it wait until—" It was distracting Marlowe's tech team during their walkthrough, so no, apparently. Gavin continued working. Then the first voice, closer now. "What exactly is the maintenance situation here?" He looked up. Celeste Marlowe was 30 years old. Gavin knew this because Dawn had briefed the facilities team on the summit's key attendees as a matter of professional protocol. What the briefing hadn't quite captured was the specific quality of her presence, the way she occupied a room not by demanding attention, but by simply radiating the expectation that things would orient around her. She was dressed in a charcoal blazer over a cream blouse, her hair pulled back with the kind of deliberate precision that looked effortless and wasn't. She was objectively beautiful in the way that powerful women sometimes are when they are also clearly very tired and not interested in discussing it. She was looking at him with an expression that wasn't quite disdain. It was something more technical than that, the assessment of a person who categorizes quickly and moves on. Behind her stood a man Gavin clocked without appearing to clock. Brent Halden, her head of security, whom he'd seen earlier in the morning doing a walkthrough. 6'2", former military by his posture, tailored suit that didn't quite hide the shoulder holster. Competent. Maybe very competent. Hard to tell without a situation. There were 2 other security staff flanking Celeste at a distance, positioned correctly, though both were watching Celeste rather than the corridor behind her, which was a small but notable mistake. "I'm fixing the display panel," Gavin said. Straightforward, no edge in it. Celeste glanced at the panel, then back at him. "How long?" "Another few minutes." "The summit begins in 2 hours. I don't want construction noise during my—" "It's a loose cable connection," Gavin said. No noise. I'll be out of the corridor before 9. Something shifted in her expression. Not satisfied, more like she'd been bracing for pushback and was mildly annoyed not to find any. "Fine." She looked at Halden. Make a note about the maintenance window for tomorrow. Halden nodded, looking at Gavin with a kind of professional neutrality that Gavin recognized and didn't take personally. Celeste began to move away, then paused. And this was the moment that would stay with everyone who witnessed it, though they wouldn't know why until later. She looked back at Gavin, at the toolbox, at the faded uniform, and then in a voice that she didn't bother to lower, "Brent, do we know if the hotel has any kind of vetting process for who they put in the VIP corridor, or do they just send whoever's available?" It landed the way those comments land. Not like a slap, which at least requires proximity, but like a door closing, efficient, almost casual. Brent glanced at Gavin with an expression that had the decency to be slightly uncomfortable. "I can look into the hotel's staff clearance protocol." "Please do." Celeste was already moving. "I'd prefer not to leave Summit security to chance." And she was gone. Her team folding around her, the corridor returning to the ordinary business of preparation. The woman with the headset looked at Gavin with something that might have been sympathy. Then she moved on too. Gavin returned his attention to the cable connection. He didn't feel the flush of humiliation that the comment had been designed to produce. That particular response required you to care what certain people thought of you, and Gavin had done enough work on himself in the past 5 years to know which voices in his life were worth waiting. Celeste Marlowe's voice, at this particular moment, in this particular corridor, was not one of them. He thought about Maisie. He thought about how she'd asked him last week why people were mean sometimes, and he told her that usually it wasn't really about you, that people carried things, and sometimes those things spilled out sideways. She's carrying something, he thought, about a woman he didn't know at all. He finished the connection, tested the panel, stable, and packed his tools. He was about to stand up when something at the far end of the corridor caught his attention. Not dramatic, not loud, just wrong. A man in a white catering jacket was standing near the service entrance to the ballroom's kitchen staging area, holding a silver tray with 2 glasses on it. That was fine. That was normal. Except that his eyes weren't on the tray or on where he was going. They were tracking the stage setup through the open ballroom doors with a quality of attention that didn't match the job. Gavin noted it, filed it. He stood, picked up his toolbox, and began walking back down the corridor. As he passed the service entrance, he slowed, not obviously, and looked at the man again. White jacket, brown hair, mid-30s maybe. He was holding the tray with his right hand. His left hand was at his side, which was normal, except that every 10 to 15 seconds, it drifted back and touched the lower right side of his jacket, just above the hip, where a jacket's interior lining would begin, checking something. Not a nervous gesture, something more deliberate, like making sure an object was still there. Gavin kept walking. He reached the end of the corridor and stopped beside a wall-mounted fire extinguisher, pulling out his phone as if checking a work order. He wasn't. He was watching the reflection in a framed mirror at the corridor's bend. The man in the white jacket had set down the tray. He was looking at the ballroom entrance again, looking at the stage, looking at the door to the left of the stage where Celeste Marlowe would enter when she came down for her final microphone check. And then the man rolled his shoulders, just once, just slightly, in a way that had nothing to do with a catering job and everything to do with a person preparing to do something difficult. Gavin's chest dropped about 3 degrees in temperature. He recognized that roll. He'd seen it before, from the other side. He found his radio. "Prewitt." He kept his voice completely level. "Yeah. I need you to get me hotel security on the event floor. I need an identity check on a male catering staff member, mid-30s, brown hair, currently at the service entrance to the Meridian staging area. White jacket. I think his credentials need to be looked at." A pause. "You think?" "I think it needs to happen now and not in 10 minutes. Static. Then, "Rourke, it's a big catering contract. They've got 40-something staff down there. I can't just—" "Don, I'm not asking you to pull everybody. I'm asking you to have someone walk over and check one man's credentials. Can that happen?" Another pause. Longer this time, with the particular length of someone deciding whether to be annoyed or accommodating. "I'll radio Tanner." Tanner was the floor security lead. Gavin had worked alongside him during 2 previous events. He was a decent man, but not particularly quick. "Tell him it's not urgent, but it's not nothing," Gavin said. "Copy that." Gavin waited. He checked the mirror reflection again. The man in the white jacket had picked up his tray again and was now moving slowly, at the pace of someone who was not trying to arrive anywhere in particular, toward the main ballroom entrance, toward the stage. Gavin checked his watch. 51 minutes before the summit began. 40 minutes, maybe less, before Celeste Marlowe would come down for the pre-event final walkthrough. Tanner appeared at the far end of the corridor 3 minutes later, moving with the unhurried pace of a man who has been told something is not urgent. Gavin caught his eye and tilted his head. Subtle, a direction, not a signal of emergency. Tanner changed course toward the catering man. Gavin watched. He saw Tanner approach. Saw the exchange, a few words, professional and casual. Saw Tanner examine something, what appeared to be an event credential badge. Saw Tanner nod and walk away. Gavin exhaled through his nose. He went to meet Tanner at the corridor junction. "Badge checked out," Tanner said, with the mild defensiveness of someone who hadn't wanted to do this in the first place. "Name on the manifest. He's been through the event check-in. Marlowe's own team pre-cleared the caterers." "What's his name?" Tanner looked at his notepad. "Desmond Farrow, listed as a senior floor server." "How long has he been with the catering company?" Tanner blinked. "I didn't ask that." "Okay." Gavin kept his face neutral. "Can you ask?" Something in Tanner's expression moved from neutral toward mildly irritated. He was 3 years from retirement and not accustomed to maintenance workers giving him action items. "Rourke, the badge cleared." "I know." "So what's the problem?" Gavin looked at him for a moment. He thought about explaining it. The shoulder roll, the repeated hand check, the pattern of attention that didn't fit the job. He knew from experience that trying to explain threat recognition to someone who hadn't developed the instinct was like describing color to someone who'd never encountered it. The words were there, but the understanding wasn't. "Nothing," Gavin said. "Thank you." Tanner walked away. Gavin stood alone in the corridor with a battered toolbox and a decision to make. The sensible thing, the reasonable, defensible, keep your head down thing, was to go back to his work orders. He'd reported it. He'd done what an employee was supposed to do. If something happened after that, it wasn't on him. He'd given the warning. He thought about Maisie, not about what she'd think of him. She was 7. She wasn't thinking about any of this. He thought about the version of himself that he wanted her to inherit. The qualities he was already trying to pass down before she was old enough to recognize what was being passed. The thing he'd figured out slowly, over 5 years of grief and adjustment, and learning to be the only parent in the room. You didn't do the right thing because the person deserved it. That wasn't the point. The math didn't run that way. He looked toward the ballroom. The man in the white jacket, Desmond Farrow, allegedly, was inside now, moving along the east wall, closer to the stage, still carrying that tray. Gavin put down his toolbox against the wall. He didn't pick it up again. He walked into the Meridian ballroom. Inside, the space was 3/4 prepared. Chairs in rows, the stage set, display panels running. The lighting was event-warm, amber-toned, the kind that was designed to make people look good and expensive. Catering staff moved between the rows, setting out glasses and small notebooks. AV technicians made final adjustments at the back console. Nobody noticed Gavin walk in. He moved along the south wall, parallel to the man in the white jacket, staying out of direct sightlines but keeping the man in his peripheral vision. Desmond Farrow had set his tray down on a side table near the stage steps. He was now standing still, facing the stage, and his left hand had gone to that spot again, lower right side of the jacket, and this time it stayed there, not checking, holding. Gavin moved. He crossed the floor at a pace that was quick enough to cover ground, but not quick enough to alarm the room. The walk of a man with somewhere to be. He came around the end of the front row and approached from a slight angle, putting himself between Farrow and the stage steps. Farrow heard him at 4 feet. Turned. For just a half second, before the man's face arranged itself into a neutral expression, Gavin saw something flare behind his eyes. Calculation, not surprise. The look of a person doing rapid math. "Hey," Gavin said. Friendly, easy. "I think you left a tray on the 14 East setup table. They're asking for it." It was nothing, just words to put the man in a position. Farrow looked at him, at the faded uniform, at the name embroidered on the chest pocket. "I don't think so," Farrow said. Yeah, they called down. Tall woman with a headset. She's a little stressed. Gavin offered a slight, harmless smile. Might want to check in with her. I'm good here. Sure. Gavin took one more step closer, casual, closing the distance by a foot without making it feel like a move. I'm going to need to see your event credential, though. Management request. They're doing a secondary check on all floor staff in the VIP stage area. Pharaoh went very still. Not surprised, still. Ready still. My badge was checked, he said. I know, this is the secondary. Gavin's voice stayed even. Shouldn't take a second. Pharaoh looked at him, looked at the corridor where Brent Halden had just appeared in the doorway, moving toward the stage at a purposeful pace. Someone had apparently radioed Halden that a maintenance worker was engaging with catering staff near the stage, which was enough of an anomaly to warrant attention. In the instant that Pharaoh's eyes moved to Halden, his right hand went inside his jacket. What came out wasn't a badge. It was a fixed-blade knife, mid-sized, the kind you could conceal under a jacket lining if the lining had been modified to hold it, which this one clearly had. The ballroom didn't explode into chaos. It froze. The particular freeze of a room full of people who are all processing the same impossible information simultaneously and none of them quite believing it yet. Gavin's body made decisions before his conscious mind fully caught up. He'd been standing at the right distance for exactly this, close enough to matter, far enough to have a split second. He shifted his weight to his back foot, let Pharaoh's first forward movement extend past him rather than into him, and took the knife hand at the wrist with both of his, not grabbing, which could be broken, but redirecting the momentum and compressing the wrist inward until the tendons objected. The knife hit the carpet. And then Brent Halden was there, fast, aggressive, trained. And he went for Gavin, because from Halden's angle at the doorway, what he'd seen was a maintenance worker engaging physically with an event guest, and his job was to put himself between Celeste Marlowe and any physical altercation. Gavin saw Halden coming and made a decision in about a quarter of a second. He couldn't let Halden reach him without Pharaoh getting loose, but he also wasn't going to put Celeste Marlowe's head of security on the floor. He sidestepped Halden's approach, let the man's momentum carry forward, and placed one hand on Halden's shoulder blade, firm, directional, not violent, and redirected him slightly left, into the end of the front row of chairs, which caught him behind the knees and sat him down hard but harmlessly. In the same motion, Gavin brought Pharaoh's already compromised wrist behind his back, applied light upward pressure, and put the man face first against the stage without enough force to cause injury, but more than enough to make the option of moving feel unappealing. The whole sequence had taken approximately 4 seconds. The ballroom was absolutely silent. Gavin's breathing was even. He looked up. Celeste Marlowe was standing at the stage entrance door, exactly where she wasn't supposed to be yet. Apparently she'd come down early, which was almost certainly what Pharaoh had factored into his timeline. She was looking at Gavin, at the man pinned against her stage, at the knife on the carpet, at the maintenance worker with the faded uniform and the name embroidered in yellow thread. Brent Halden pulled himself upright from the chair row. He was breathing harder than Gavin was. He looked from Pharaoh to Gavin to the knife and back to Gavin, and the expression on his face was something Gavin recognized too. The particular look of a man recalibrating every assumption he's made in the last 30 minutes. Somewhere in the ballroom, someone found their voice and called for police. Gavin stayed where he was, one hand on Pharaoh's wrist, pressure steady, nothing more than what was needed, and waited for the authorities to arrive. He wasn't thinking about the woman who'd questioned his place in the corridor. He wasn't thinking about being vindicated or acknowledged. He was thinking about a permission slip on a kitchen counter and whether he'd be home before 7. Maisie didn't like it when dinner was late. The police arrived in 11 minutes. That was the official response time later entered into the incident report. 11 minutes from the moment someone in the ballroom called dispatch to the moment. 2 uniformed officers pushed through the Meridian Ballroom's main doors. 11 minutes during which Gavin Rourke held Desmond Pharaoh against the stage with one hand on his wrist and the other braced against the man's shoulder blade. And nobody in the room said much of anything because nobody in the room had yet figured out what to say. Pharaoh stopped struggling after about 40 seconds. Not because he'd given up exactly, more like he'd done the math and understood that the math wasn't going anywhere interesting for him. I was breathing through his nose in the controlled way of someone managing anger rather than fear. And once or twice he turned his head slightly to the left, as if he could see something in his peripheral vision that Gavin couldn't. Gavin didn't know what he was looking at. He kept his pressure steady and his own eyes moving across the room. Brent Halden had gotten himself upright from the chair row and was now standing 6 feet away with his weapon drawn, pointed at Pharaoh, not at Gavin, which was a correction Halden had made quickly and without being asked. His breathing had steadied. He was watching Gavin with an expression that had moved through several rooms in a short amount of time and was now parked somewhere between professional assessment and the specific discomfort of a man who knows he got something wrong. Celeste Marlowe hadn't moved from the stage entrance. That was the thing Gavin kept noting in his peripheral awareness. Not because she was in danger anymore, but because her stillness was unusual. In his experience, when people witness something like this, they either move toward it or away from it. They wanted distance or they wanted information. Celeste was doing neither. She was just standing there with her arms at her sides and her eyes on Gavin, and whatever she was thinking, she was keeping it somewhere nobody else could reach. The rest of the ballroom had organized itself into the aftermath shape that these things always took. People clustered at the back, the AV technicians having retreated to the soundboard area, 3 of the catering staff standing near the west wall with their trays still in their hands because they hadn't known what to do with them, and the muscle memory of holding something had been easier than making a decision. The woman with the headset was on her radio, her voice low and rapid. 2 of Celeste's other security staff had appeared from somewhere and were now standing near their boss in the doorway, arriving, Gavin noticed, about 3 minutes after they should have. He said nothing about that. When the uniformed officers came through the door, Gavin announced himself clearly, gave his name, his position, and a 30-second factual account of what had happened and in what order. He indicated the knife on the carpet. He maintained his hold on Pharaoh until one of the officers took over, and then he stepped back, put his hands at his sides, and waited. The officer, young, a little keyed up, the way you are when you arrive at a scene and the situation is already over but your adrenaline hasn't processed that yet, looked at Gavin, then at the knife, then at Halden, who nodded once. "You work here?" the officer asked Gavin. "Maintenance," Gavin said. "Third floor facilities team." The officer wrote something down. His partner was already on the radio calling for detectives. Pharaoh was cuffed and brought upright. Up close, with the performance stripped away, he looked older than Gavin had initially estimated, pushing 40, with deep lines around his mouth and eyes that had the flat quality of someone who has been running on grievance for a long time. He looked at Gavin once, when they turned him around. Not with hatred. With something closer to the exhausted recognition of a man who had lost a coin flip. He didn't say anything. They took him out through the main doors and the room exhaled. Gavin bent down and picked up his work radio from the carpet where it had slipped from his belt during the altercation. The casing had a new crack in it. He looked at it for a moment, then clipped it back on. "Mr. Rourke." He turned. Brent Halden was standing 3 feet away. Up close, without the urgency of the situation between them, he was a more tired-looking man than his posture suggested. He had gray at his temples that his haircut tried to minimize, and there was a tension in his jaw that looked chronic rather than situational. "That's your name?" Halden said. "Rourke?" "Yeah." Halden looked at him for a long moment. "Where did you train?" "I didn't train anywhere that matters right now." It wasn't evasion exactly. It was just the truth of how Gavin had decided to handle the question, which he'd been anticipating since about the 30-second mark of the situation. Halden's jaw tightened slightly. "What you did with me. The redirect. That's not something you pick up on YouTube." "No," Gavin agreed. "I'd like to know who I'm dealing with." "You're dealing with a maintenance worker at the Ashford Crown Hotel," Gavin said. Not hard, not sarcastic, just factual. "That's who you're dealing with right now." Halden studied him for another moment, then nodded slowly. Not satisfied, but deciding to accept it. "Okay." He paused. "For what it's worth. I should have moved faster on your radio call. That's on me." Gavin looked at him. "Who told you I'd radioed in?" "Tanner, when he called me to the ballroom. He mentioned you'd flagged the situation earlier." Halden's expression moved in a direction that was clearly not comfortable for him. "I got here when I got here. You were already handling it." "Tanner said it wasn't urgent." "He did." Halden said this without blaming Tanner out loud, though the implication sat there clearly enough. I should have come anyway. Gavin didn't fill the silence with absolution. Halden hadn't asked for it, and Gavin didn't feel like distributing it. Is she all right? Gavin asked instead, tilting his head toward the doorway where Celeste had been standing. She was no longer there. Someone had moved her, or she'd moved herself, in the organized shuffle of the last few minutes. She's in the VIP prep room with my team, Halden said. Yes, she's fine. The word fine landed with the specific weight of two people who both understood it didn't mean what it said. Good, Gavin said. He picked up his toolbox from the corridor where he'd left it and walked toward the service elevator. Nobody stopped him. Well, Dawn Prewitt was waiting for him on the service level, which told Gavin that the radio traffic had moved fast, and that Dawn had been tracking it with the particular anxiety of a facilities manager who was about to be involved in a very long afternoon of incident reports. Dawn was 54, heavy-set in the way of a man who used to be athletic and had made peace with the transition, with a thick mustache that he'd had since his 30s and showed no signs of reconsidering. He was a good manager, in the specific sense that he left competent people alone and ran interference when the hotel's upper management had ideas that didn't make operational sense. Gavin respected him without feeling the need to say so frequently. You want to tell me what happened? Dawn said, falling into step beside Gavin. I put it in my incident report. I'd like to hear it from you directly. Gavin walked him through it in the same order he'd given the police. Concise, factual, no drama added for texture. The cable repair. The corridor. The man in the white jacket. The radio call. Tanner's credential check. The decision to go back into the ballroom. The knife. Dawn listened without interrupting. When Gavin finished, Dawn was quiet for a moment. Tanner's going to have a rough afternoon, he said finally. Tanner did what I asked him to do. Tanner didn't ask the right follow-up questions. Nobody told him to. Dawn looked at him sideways. You're covering for him. I'm being accurate, Gavin said. There's a difference. Dawn stopped walking. Gavin stopped too. You know they're going to want to talk to you, Dawn said. The detectives. Marlowe's people. Probably the hotel's legal team before end of day. I know. You okay with that? Gavin thought about it honestly, which was the only way he thought about things. I'd like to pick up Maisie from after-school care by 6, he said. As long as I can do that, everything else is manageable. Dawn looked at him for a long time. There was something in his expression that wasn't quite sentiment but was adjacent to it. The look of a man who wanted to say something real and wasn't entirely sure how to start. I'm going to tell you something, Dawn said, and I need you to not make it weird. Gavin waited. I've managed maintenance teams for 20 years in 3 different cities, 4 different hotels. Dawn paused. I've never had a guy on my crew who could do what you just did. And I've also never had a guy who... He stopped again. I don't know what you walked away from to get here. I've never asked because it wasn't my business. But whatever it was... He trailed off, tried once more. Maisie's lucky, is all I'm saying. Gavin held his gaze for a moment. Thanks, Dawn. Don't make it weird. I'm not making it weird. Good. Dawn put his hands back in his pockets and turned toward his office. Go talk to the detectives and then take a long lunch. It's covered. Sit. The detectives arrived at 11:40, 2 of them, plain clothes, from the downtown precinct. Detective Anita Solis was the lead, compact, direct, with the practiced patience of someone who interviewed people for a living and had stopped being surprised by most things around year 7. Her partner, Detective Carl Embry, was newer and took more notes than he needed to, which was a habit he'd probably lose eventually. They took Gavin through the morning twice, in the way detectives do. The first time for the shape of it, the second time for the details that don't match. He answered every question directly, and without elaboration he hadn't been asked for. At one point, Solis looked up from her notepad and said, You radioed hotel security before you engaged, is that right? Yes. And they cleared the individual's credentials? Yes. And you still went back in? It wasn't quite a question. Gavin treated it like one anyway. Yes. Solis held his gaze. Most people would have let it go at that point, called it a day. I know. Why didn't you? He thought about the question seriously, which she seemed to appreciate. Because the badge clearing didn't change what I'd seen, and a credential check isn't the same thing as a behavioral check. He had the right paperwork. He didn't have the right patterns. Behavioral patterns, Solis repeated. Yes. You've had training in that area. I've had experience in that area, Gavin said. There was a difference, and he meant it. Solis made a note. We're going to need to confirm your background. Standard procedure. That's fine. She gave him a card. He gave her his contact information. She said they might have follow-up questions. He said that was fine too. When they were done, Embry shook his hand. Solis didn't, but she looked at him on the way out with an expression that communicated more than a handshake would have anyway. The information about Desmond Farrow came back in pieces through the afternoon, filtering through the hotel's security office, and eventually reaching Don Prewitt, who shared what he could with Gavin because Don was the kind of manager who believed his people deserved context. The forged credentials were confirmed within 2 hours. The name Desmond Farrow existed. It belonged to a genuine employee of the catering company, a man who was discovered to have called in sick that morning and whose badge information had been duplicated onto a clean credential card with enough quality to pass a standard check. The man currently in custody had a different name. The police weren't releasing it yet. What Don could tell Gavin, what had been confirmed through the detective's initial investigation, was that the man had a documented grievance against Celeste Marlowe's company, a subsidiary acquisition 3 years ago that had resulted in the closure of a manufacturing facility, several hundred jobs. The man in custody had been one of the managers who'd lost his position, and apparently the calculus of 3 years of compounding anger had brought him to a hotel ballroom in a modified catering jacket with a concealed blade. Corporate dispute, Don said, saying the words the way you'd say something that's technically accurate but profoundly insufficient. That's what they're calling it. Gavin sat with that for a moment. He didn't feel much about it in the way people expected you to feel about information like this. No retrospective fear, no shaky hands relief. Mostly, he felt a low, heavy sadness for a man who had let something eat him hollow over 3 years and arrived at the only door he could still see open. That was a waste. Not of his own prospects, but of whatever that man used to be before the anger became the whole architecture of his life. The fake name cleared because nobody checked hire date, Gavin said. Don nodded. He'd been with the company 2 years on paper. The real Desmond Farrow had been there 4. Standard check against the manifest wouldn't have caught it unless someone asked how long the individual had personally been employed. Which I asked Tanner to look into. Which Tanner didn't follow up on, Don said without relish. Yeah. Gavin looked at the ceiling. The manifest security protocol needs to include hire date verification for VIP events. I know, I'm already writing it. And behavioral observation training for floor security, not just credential literacy. Also on the list. Don paused. You want to write the training curriculum? Gavin looked at him. Joking, Don said, though he said it in the way of a man who wasn't entirely joking. By 2 in the afternoon, the summit had resumed. This was its own kind of remarkable set, the organizational machinery of a major investor event grinding forward, because 200 attendees had schedules and the hotel had obligations, and Celeste Marlowe, apparently, had decided that the appropriate response to almost being stabbed was to go back to work. Gavin was on the 9th floor replacing a thermostat sensor when he became aware that someone from Celeste's team had been looking for him. The woman with the headset, whose name turned out to be Petra, which he found out from Dawn, had come by the facilities office asking where he was assigned for the afternoon. Dawn had told her, and about 20 minutes after that, his radio crackled. Rourke, Dawn's voice. When you get a break, Ms. Marlowe would like to speak with you. Whenever works for you? Her words, not mine. Gavin finished the thermostat calibration first because the guest in 912 had been dealing with a faulty temperature reading for 2 days, and that was the job he'd been given, and it wasn't done yet. When it was done, he rode the elevator down. They'd put Celeste in one of the smaller executive meeting rooms off the main lobby, a room that was used for private conversations and contract signings and the occasional interview when the hotel hosted media events. It had a round table, 6 chairs, and a window that looked out over the hotel's side courtyard where a fountain ran year-round. Gavin knocked on the door and opened it. Celeste was alone, which surprised him. He'd expected at least one of her team. She was sitting at the table with a glass of water in front of her that appeared to have been there long enough to develop condensation, which meant she'd been in this room for a while and hadn't been drinking it. Her jacket was off, draped over the back of the chair beside her, and she had her forearms on the table with her hands loosely clasped, which was the posture of someone who has spent the last few hours projecting composure and is now, in a room with one other person, allowing the effort to show. She looked up when he came in. "Sit down," she said. Then, "Please. Sorry, sit down, please." He sat across from her. He didn't put his toolbox in the chair this time. He set it on the floor beside him. Old habit. You didn't put things on furniture in rooms where someone else set the tone. Celeste looked at him for a moment that was longer than a casual look, but not uncomfortable. She was taking him in the way she probably should have that morning, actually looking, without the classification system running ahead of the observation. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Two of them, actually." Gavin waited. "The first one is for this morning, what I said in the corridor about staff clearance and what I'd prefer." She said it without softening it, which he appreciated. "That was condescending. I said it in front of your colleagues, and it was condescending, and I'm sorry." "Okay," Gavin said. She blinked. He could tell she'd been expecting something more, a wave-off, a magnanimous, "it's fine," some form of social lubrication. He wasn't offering any. "Okay," she repeated, testing the word. "The second apology is—" She paused, and he saw something shift in her expression. Not the practiced composure, something underneath it. "You flagged the threat before anyone on my team did. You reported it. Someone cleared it, and you didn't walk away." She stopped. "You didn't have any reason to stay. After what I said to you, you had every reason to—" "That's not how I make those decisions," Gavin said. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "Whether I stay or go in a situation, that's not something I calculate based on whether someone's been nice to me recently." She was quiet for a moment. "That's either very disciplined or very strange." "Probably both," he said. The faintest thing, almost not a smile, crossed her face and disappeared. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Who are you?" She said it simply, not rudely, more like someone who had been holding the question for several hours and had run out of reasons to keep holding it. "And I mean that genuinely. I know your name, and I know you work here. But who are you?" Gavin considered the question with the same seriousness he'd given the detective's questions. "I'm a maintenance worker," he said. "I have a 7-year-old daughter. I live about 20 minutes from here. I try to be home before dark most nights because she doesn't sleep as well when I'm late." Celeste studied him. "That's not an answer to what I asked." "It's the most important answer I've got," he said, and he meant it. She looked at him for a long moment. He didn't fill the silence, and she didn't push into it. Outside the window, the courtyard fountain ran its loop, water cycling up through a stone basin, falling, cycling up again. Peaceful and slightly monotonous in the way of things that just keep going regardless of what happens near them. "He came in with forged credentials," Celeste said finally. Her voice was quieter now. "My team pre-cleared the caterers. The manifest was checked. Brent ran a walkthrough at 6 this morning." She paused. "I pay for extremely good security, Mr. Rourke, and what that means in practice is that I've spent a long time believing it was enough." Gavin didn't say anything to that. "You noticed something my entire team missed," she said. "You, in a maintenance uniform, carrying a toolbox." She stopped, restarted. "What did you see that they didn't?" It was a real question. He could hear that it was real. "Credentials verify identity," Gavin said. "They don't verify intent. Someone with the right badge can still have the wrong agenda, and the badge check doesn't catch that. What catches that is watching how people move, where their attention goes, what their hands do when they think nobody's looking. Behavioral observation. Basically. Is that something you can teach?" "Yes," he said. "But it takes time, and most people want a system instead. Checklists and protocols. Those are useful, but they have gaps. Behavior doesn't really fit in a checklist." Celeste was quiet, absorbing this. "Your security team isn't bad," Gavin said. He wanted to be accurate, not harsh. "Halden's capable. His people are positioned well, mostly. They just defaulted to the same verification system everyone defaults to, and this particular threat was designed to pass that system." "But you caught it anyway." "I caught it early enough," he said. That's different." She nodded slowly. Then she said, "Brent told me you redirected him. During the altercation, that you could have—" She stopped. He was responding to what he saw from the doorway, Gavin said. From his angle, I was engaging with a guest near the stage. He moved the way he's trained to move. That's not a mistake, that's a correct response to incomplete information. You're being generous. I'm being accurate. Same thing I told Dawn about Tanner. She looked at him with something that might have been the early stages of respect. Not the finished product, which takes time, but the raw material. You're an interesting man, Mr. Rourke, she said. Gavin, he said. She nodded. Gavin. They sat in the comfortable near silence for a moment more. Is there anything you need? She asked. From me. Or from the hotel. Is there anything? I need to pick up my daughter by 6, he said. And I'd like to not be in any press coverage if that's something your team can manage. My daughter doesn't need to see her dad on the news. Celeste blinked. That's it? That's it. She held his gaze for another moment, and he thought he saw something working behind her eyes. A reassessment that was bigger than just him. The kind of reassessment you don't complete in a single afternoon. I'll make sure of both, she said. Gavin stood. He picked up his toolbox. He gave her a nod that was professional and genuine at the same time, which was the only kind he had. For what it's worth, he said at the door, your event went well, from what I could tell. The display panel issue's been fixed. Audio should be clean for the afternoon session. Celeste looked at him. This man in his faded uniform talking about panel displays and audio quality 4 hours after he'd disarmed a man in her ballroom. Thank you, she said. And this time, the words had a different weight than they would have had this morning. Gavin closed the door behind him and walked back to the service elevator. He had a thermostat on the 11th floor that needed a follow-up check, and after that, Dawn had 2 work orders backed up from the morning. And he needed to remember to call Jefferson Elementary about that permission slip before 3 o'clock, because the field trip was Thursday, and Maisie had been talking about the feathered dinosaurs for 2 weeks. He pulled out his phone in the elevator and made a note. Permission slip. Call by 3. The doors opened on the service level. He walked out. The afternoon was half gone, and there was still work to do. I made it to Jefferson Elementary by 5:53. That was 7 minutes to spare, which by Gavin's standards qualified as comfortable. The after-school care program ran until 6:15, but the woman who ran it, a brisk, kind woman named Mrs. Aguilar, who had been doing this job for 19 years and had the particular energy of someone who genuinely liked children and genuinely needed her day to end on schedule, always seemed visibly relieved when parents arrived before the last possible moment. Gavin parked in the pickup loop, signed the release clipboard, and found Maisie in the activity room at a low table with 2 other kids, arguing about something with the focused intensity that 7-year-olds brought to arguments, which was to say, complete conviction on all sides and zero interest in resolution. She looked up when she saw him, and the argument stopped mid-sentence, immediately forgotten. Dad. She said it the way she always said it. Not a greeting exactly, more like a confirmation. He's here. The day is complete. The world is calibrated correctly. She grabbed her backpack from the hook by the door, said a rapid goodbye to her table companions that they barely acknowledged, because the argument had already resumed without her, and pushed through the activity room door to where Gavin was crouching to her level in the hallway. How was school? Mrs. Petrakis says we're doing the water cycle next week, and I already know how the water cycle works, so I'll probably be bored, Maisie said, with the specific 7-year-old combination of pride and preemptive complaint. You might learn something new about it. She considered this with appropriate skepticism. Maybe. She looked at his face with the directness that kids her age hadn't yet learned to soften. You look tired. Little bit. Did something happen at work? Yeah. She accepted this without pressing it, which was something he'd noticed about her lately. She was developing a patience with his brief answers that surprised him sometimes, a willingness to let information arrive when it arrived. He didn't know if that was her nature or something she'd learned from watching him. Can we have the soup tonight? She asked, meaning the lentil soup he made on days when neither of them had the bandwidth for anything more complicated. She'd named it the soup specifically, as if there were only one in the world. Yeah, he said, we can have the soup. She took his hand on the way to the car. She didn't always do that anymore. She was 7, and there was a version of herself she was starting to construct that was more independent, more contained. But today she did. He didn't say anything about it. He just held on. The The apartment was on the third floor of a building that had been renovated about 15 years ago and not significantly updated since. The elevator worked most of the time. The hallway carpet was a shade of beige that no longer existed in the natural world. The apartment itself was clean and genuinely lived in. Books on the coffee table, Maisie's drawings on the refrigerator, Gerald the stuffed elephant still facing the wall on the bookshelf, which Gavin had decided to leave alone and let resolve itself in its own time. He made the soup. Maisie sat at the kitchen counter doing her reading homework, which consisted of a chapter from a book about a dog who solves mysteries, which she was describing to him in fragments while he cooked, not seeming to notice or care that he was only catching about half of it. And the dog knew it was the neighbor because of the footprints, but nobody believed him because he's a dog and dogs can't talk. But he can communicate through barking in a specific pattern. Dad, are you listening? The dog uses bark patterns, Gavin said. Morse code, basically, Maisie said approvingly. But for dogs. Smart dog. Very smart dog. She turned a page. His name is Webster. Of course it is. He stirred the soup and thought about the afternoon. About Celeste in the meeting room with her untouched water glass and her jacket off the back of the chair. About Brent Halden in the corridor that morning, drawing his weapon and pointing it at the right person at the wrong moment, and then correcting it. About the man they'd taken out in handcuffs, and the 3 years of quiet destruction that had apparently preceded those 11 minutes in the Meridian ballroom. He didn't feel heroic about any of it. That was the thing people didn't quite understand about trained response. It didn't feel the way movies suggested it felt. It felt like doing the next necessary thing, and then the next one after that. The clarity of a situation like that one was almost mechanical. It was the before and after that cost you something. Dad. Yeah. Why do people get so mad that they do bad things? He turned the burner down and looked at her. She was still looking at her book, but the question wasn't about Webster the detective dog. He could tell by the quality of her stillness. What made you think about that? He asked. She shrugged. The 7-year-old shrug that meant she'd been thinking about something for a while and didn't entirely want to explain the path that got her there. Jalen at school said his brother is mad all the time, and it makes him break things. And Mrs. Petrakis said sometimes people break things because they don't know how to say what they're feeling. She paused. Is that true? Gavin ladled soup into bowls. He thought about how to say something real to a 7-year-old without simplifying it into something false. I think some people carry bad things for a long time, he said, and eventually the carrying gets too heavy and they put it down wrong. They drop it on other people instead of figuring out how to set it down carefully. Maisie thought about this. What if they don't know how to set it down carefully? Then they need help learning, and if they don't get help, sometimes the dropping hurts people. He set her bowl in front of her. That's why it matters that you learn how to carry things, even when it's hard, even when the things are heavy. She picked up her spoon and looked at the soup. How do you learn that? Mostly by watching people who do it well, he said, and sometimes by dropping things yourself and seeing what happens, and getting back up. She nodded thoughtfully, in the way that suggested she'd file this somewhere and retrieve it later at an unexpected moment. They ate the soup. He signed the permission slip, which was on the counter exactly where he'd thought he'd left it. She told him more about Webster. He listened, most of it this time. When she was in bed and the apartment was quiet, he sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and his phone, reading through the work orders for tomorrow and trying to downgrade his nervous system from the register it had been running at all day. His phone lit up with a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail. Then he answered. Mr. Rourke. A woman's voice, professional. Not Celeste, a different register. My name is Sharon Yee. I'm the communications director for Marlowe Capital. Miss Marlowe asked me to reach out and confirm that we've spoken with the hotel's PR team, and your name will not appear in any of our official communications regarding today's incident. All media inquiries will be directed to our prepared statement, which references only hotel security personnel. I appreciate that, Gavin said. Ms. Marlowe also wanted me to let you know that if you have any concerns or require any support, legal, financial, anything, her office is available. A professional pause. She was quite direct about that. I don't have any concerns, Gavin said, but thank you. Of course. Another pause, and then, slightly off script. For what it's worth, Mr. Rourke, I've worked with Ms. Marlowe for 4 years. I've never heard her ask communications to take a call like this personally. The woman's voice had shifted just slightly, still professional, but with a small human note underneath it. She was insistent. Gavin thanked her again and hung up. He sat with the phone face down on the table for a moment. Then he went to bed, because tomorrow was Wednesday, and Wednesday meant Maisie had a reading group at 7:45, which meant he needed to be up by 6. He didn't expect anything from the next morning. That was the honest truth. He expected to come in, collect his work orders, and return to the ordinary cadence of the Ashford Crown's maintenance needs. What he got instead was Brent Halden. Halden was waiting in the service corridor just inside the staff entrance when Gavin arrived at 6:50. He was in the same suit as yesterday, or one exactly like it, and he was holding 2 coffees from the cart in the hotel lobby. The good cart, the one with the Italian machine, and the price point that maintenance workers did not typically use. He held one out when Gavin approached. Gavin stopped and looked at the coffee, then at Halden. "Don't read too much into it," Halden said. "I was getting one anyway." "Sure," Gavin said. He took it. They stood in the service corridor, which was not a location that had been designed for conversations of any significance. Low ceilings, exposed pipes, the background hum of the building's mechanical systems. But Halden had picked it, and Gavin didn't move them. "I talked to the detectives last night," Halden said. "The full picture on the credential forgery. How the hire date discrepancy was the tell." "Yeah. I've been doing executive protection for 11 years, Halden said. "I have never had a hire date verification step in my pre-event credential protocol." He said it flatly. Not fishing for reassurance, just stating a fact that he was now stuck with. "Most people don't," Gavin said. "It's not a standard step." "It is now," Halden said. "For my team." He drank his coffee. "I also watched the ballroom footage from this morning. They pulled it for the investigation." He paused. "Twice, actually." Gavin waited. "You went into the ballroom 11 minutes after Tanner cleared him," Halden said. "You put yourself between the stage steps and the target without making it visible. Then you created a verbal situation that forced him to either produce identification or act." He stopped. "That's a deliberate funnel. You structured the engagement to make him show his hand without giving him a clean line to the principal." Gavin drank his coffee. "That's not something you learn in a weekend security course," Halden said. "No," Gavin agreed. "So I'll ask you again," Halden said. "Not out of nosiness, out of professional respect, which I should have led with yesterday, instead of treating you like a scene variable." He paused. "Who did you work for?" Gavin was quiet for a moment. The building hummed around them. Somewhere above, the hotel was waking up. He could feel it in the pipes, the faint vibration of kitchen equipment on the food service level starting its morning cycle. "I worked private executive protection for 6 years," he said. "Started with a firm in Atlanta, moved to an independent contractor arrangement for the last 2, principally Western Europe and the Gulf region. Some domestic." He paused. "I left when my wife died. 4 years, 9 months ago." Halden absorbed this without comment for a moment. "The firm in Atlanta. Were they Whitmore?" Gavin looked at him. "I know the name because they had a strong reputation for behavioral work," Halden said. "Unusual for a firm that size." "I learned most of what I know from a man named Victor Aldane," Gavin said. "He ran the behavioral program there, retired now." He looked at his coffee. "He was very good." "He taught you what you did in that ballroom?" "He taught me how to think about it. The doing is just muscle. That part doesn't really go away." Halden nodded slowly. He seemed to be working through something. "You could have stayed in the work." "I know." "You chose not to." "Yes." Halden looked at him directly. "Why?" Gavin looked back at him with the same directness. "My daughter needed a parent who came home every night. Not a parent who came home most nights. Every night." He paused. "The work I was doing, the level I was operating at, that wasn't compatible, so I made a choice." Halden was quiet. He had the expression of a man who understood the arithmetic of that decision and was doing his own private version of it. "Do you regret it?" Halden asked. "No," Gavin said, without hesitation, without performance. Halden studied him for another moment. Then he did something that Gavin hadn't expected. He extended his right hand, not the automatic professional handshake, something more deliberate, offered with the same directness that Gavin had been using on him all morning, which meant Halden had been paying attention. Gavin shook it. I came after you in that ballroom, Halden said. I had you wrong. You had the information bad, Gavin said. You acted on it. I should have moved faster when you radioed, and I should have. Halden stopped. Tried again. You had a clean shot at making me look bad. You didn't take it. I appreciate that. You weren't my problem, Gavin said. He was. Halden held his gaze for a moment longer. Then something in his face settled. The specific settling of a man who has decided to respect something and stop arguing with himself about it. I'm going to redesign our pre-event sweep protocol, Halden said. I'd like to run the behavioral observation component by someone who knows what they're doing, off the record, informal. He paused. Would you be willing to look at it and tell me if I'm missing anything obvious? Gavin looked at him. You can say no, Halden said. I'm not going to say no, Gavin said. Send it to Don Prewitt. He'll get it to me. Halden nodded. He picked up his coffee. He seemed about to walk away, then stopped. She's going to want to offer you something, he said. Celeste. She's already talking about it. He looked at Gavin with an expression that was honest without being intrusive. Whatever she offers, the way you handle it is going to matter to her. She's watching how you are, not what you say. I know, Gavin said. Halden looked at him, then nodded once more. He walked away down the service corridor and Gavin finished his coffee in the low hum of the building's morning mechanics. He didn't see Celeste again until late afternoon. The summit's second day had a different energy than the first, less formal, more working session-oriented, the kind of afternoon where the investor conversations happened in smaller rooms and the main ballroom stood empty. Gavin had been up and down the building all day with his regular work orders. A grout issue in one of the 7th floor bathrooms, a door seal on the kitchen loading dock that had been flagging for a week, a ceiling light replacement in the 2nd floor conference room that required the rolling ladder, and a colleague's help to execute, because the ceiling height was just past his comfortable solo reach. He was returning the rolling ladder to the maintenance storage room on 3 when Petra, the woman with the headset, found him in the corridor. Ms. Marlowe's heading down in about 15 minutes, she said. She'd like 5 minutes if you have it. Gavin checked his watch. He had a work order on 5 that could wait 20 minutes. Where? The East Garden. She said it's less formal that way. The hotel's East Garden was a courtyard space accessible through the lobby's east wing. Not large, a contained rectangular space with boxwood hedging, a few stone benches, and a Japanese maple in the center that turned red in October and was currently in its summer green. It was used mostly by guests who needed a phone call and something resembling fresh air without leaving the property. Celeste was already there when he arrived, sitting on one of the stone benches with her phone in her hand. She was wearing different clothes from yesterday, charcoal slacks and a dark green blouse, her hair down for the first time since he'd seen her, which made her look slightly less like a presentation and slightly more like a person. She put the phone away when she saw him. Thank you for coming, she said. He sat on the bench across from her, which made it feel something like a meeting, which was probably appropriate. He put his toolbox beside him out of habit. She looked at the toolbox for a second, not with the assessment of yesterday morning. Something different, something quieter. I did some reading last night, she said. About what? About you. She said it without apology, which he respected. Or what I could find, which wasn't much. You maintained a fairly low profile for someone at the level you apparently operated. Gavin looked at her steadily. What did you find? A name attached to a security consultancy registration that lapsed about 4 years ago. Some professional references in a trade directory that haven't been updated. A commendation letter on record with an industry organization that you never claimed publicly. She paused. And a woman named Dana Rourke, née Calloway, who passed away 4 years and 10 months ago. Aneurysm. She was 27. He didn't look away. I'm sorry, Celeste said. For her. And I'm sorry I dug into your life without asking. She held his gaze. I needed to understand who you were. That's a habit in my industry, and I don't always stop to think about whether it's an appropriate one. You wanted to know who you were dealing with, Gavin said. Yes. That's reasonable? Maybe. She didn't seem entirely convinced by her own justification. I found out that you walked away from a career where you were apparently very well regarded to carry a toolbox. She said the last part not with the condescension of yesterday morning. with the unedited confusion of someone who genuinely could not organize this information into a shape that made sense to them. "To raise my daughter," he said. "The toolbox is just the job." "You could have done both," she said. "Plenty of people do." "Plenty of people do a version of both," he said. "That's not the same thing. The version of that work I was doing, travel, irregular hours, genuine risk, that's not compatible with being the parent I wanted to be. I've watched people try. The compromise doesn't go the way they think it's going to go." He paused. "I'd already watched my own father try it." She looked at him carefully. "He was in the same work?" "Military. Different kind of distance, same effect." He looked at the maple in the center of the courtyard. "I loved my father. I also know what it cost, growing up with a man who was technically present and actually somewhere else. He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't want to give Maisie a version of me. I wanted to give her me." Celeste was quiet. The garden held that quietness for a moment. The ambient sound of the city filtered through the hedging, distant but present. "I want to offer you something," she said. "And I want to be honest with you about what it is and what it isn't." "Okay." "I have a corporate security division," she said. 12 people. Brent leads them. They handle personal protection and asset security across my organization. We restructured it 18 months ago, and there's a training and protocol development position that I've been trying to fill with the right person for about 8 months. She paused. "It's a real position, not a courtesy title. The person in it would be responsible for building out the behavioral observation component of our pre-event security framework, training Brent's team, reviewing protocols, running assessments. It's not field work, it's design and education." She looked at him. "It would pay significantly more than what you're earning here. The hours are controlled. Most of it is schedulable in advance. I've designed the role around the possibility that the right person might have specific personal commitments." She paused on those last 2 words briefly. "No travel unless you choose to travel. Headquarters is 11 blocks from this hotel." She stopped. "Let it sit." Gavin looked at the maple tree. "Why are you telling me the details about hours and travel?" he asked. "Because I did my homework," she said, "and I think those are the factors that matter to you." He looked at her. "You're trying to build an offer I can't say no to." "Yes," she said, without embarrassment. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "It's honest." He paused. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Yesterday morning, in the corridor, would you have spoken to me the way you did if I'd been wearing a suit and a badge?" She held his gaze. He could see she'd thought about this already, had probably thought about it most of the night. "No," she said. "I wouldn't have." "What was different?" "The uniform," she said. "The toolbox. The context." She stopped. "I made a rapid assessment, and I was wrong." She said it cleanly, without the layered qualifications that people usually wrapped around admissions like that. "I've been in rooms with incompetent people in expensive clothes and capable people in coveralls, and I know better than to use the clothes as the data. I know that, and I still did it." "Why?" She thought about it, really thought, which he noticed. "Because I was tired," she said. "And when I'm tired, I fall back on shortcuts. And the shortcuts I fall back on are the ones I absorbed without meaning to, a long time ago." She paused. "That's not an excuse." "I know it isn't," he said. "I'm asking because I think you know that too, and the fact that you know it is the more interesting part." She studied him. "You're not what I expected." "I know," he said. "You mentioned." Something real moved across her face, almost a laugh, but quieter. "So," she waited. "What do you think?" He was quiet for a long moment. The maple tree, the distant city sound, the steady background fact of who he was and what he'd chosen and what it had cost and what it had given him. "I think you've built a genuinely thoughtful offer," he said, "and I think you mean it sincerely." "But?" "No, but yet," he said. "I'm going to think about it." She blinked. He could tell this was not the pace she operated at. "How long do you need?" she asked. "A few days," he said. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Then, "Okay. I'll give you an answer before the weekend," he said. "That's a commitment." She nodded. Something in her settled, the trained executive reflex of accepting a timeline she could work with, even if it wasn't her preferred one. "One more question," she said. "Okay." "Your daughter, Maisie." She said the name carefully, like she was aware of what it meant to say someone's child's name to them. "Does she know what you did? Before the hotel, I mean, the work you were trained for." "She knows I used to have a different job," Gavin said. "She knows it was something where I helped keep people safe." He paused. "She thinks it's like being a crossing guard. I haven't corrected her." Celeste looked at him for a moment. "That might be the most accurate description of executive protection I've ever heard." This time the thing that moved across his face was also almost a laugh. He stood. He picked up his toolbox. "Before Friday," he said. "Before Friday," she agreed. He walked back through the east wing. The lobby was mid-afternoon quiet, and checkouts done, check-ins not yet begun. A family with 2 young kids was waiting near the concierge desk, the smaller child dragging a stuffed animal by one arm in a way that reminded him of how Maisie had carried Gerald before Gerald's recent demotion to the bookshelf. He thought about what he was going to tell her. Before Friday. What the answer actually was, underneath the few days he'd asked for. He was pretty sure he already knew. He took the service elevator back up. There was a pressure valve on the 7th floor that Dawn had flagged in the afternoon report, and it needed looking at before the end of the day. He had about 90 minutes. That was enough. The pressure valve on 7 turned out to be a straightforward fix. A worn gasket that had been compressing unevenly and causing intermittent pressure fluctuations in the hot water line serving 3 guest rooms. Gavin had the replacement part in his kit, which saved a trip to the supply room, and he was done in under 40 minutes. He stood in the service corridor afterward and wrote up the repair log on his phone with the particular thoroughness that Dawn appreciated. Not just what he'd fixed, but what had caused it, because a symptom without a documented cause was just a problem waiting to repeat itself. He'd learned that from a man named Aldane, actually, though Aldane had been talking about threat assessment and not plumbing at the time. The principal transferred. He thought about the East Garden, about Celeste sitting on the stone bench with her phone put away and her hair down, building an offer she'd designed around his life without asking whether he wanted it built. He wasn't annoyed by that. He'd been honest with himself about that on the elevator ride up. It would have been easy to frame it as presumptuous, a billionaire assuming she knew what he needed and constructing a package accordingly. But that framing wasn't accurate. What she'd actually done was pay attention. She'd taken the information she had about who he was and what he valued, and she'd tried to respond to the actual person rather than a generic version of an employee. That was, in his experience, rarer than it should be. The question wasn't whether the offer was genuine. It was. The question was whether it changed anything. He clipped his phone back onto his belt and walked toward the service elevator. Thursday passed quietly. Maisie went to the Natural History Museum with her class and came home with a handout about the Cretaceous period and a strong opinion about feathered velociraptors that she delivered to Gavin over dinner with the intensity of someone presenting a legal argument. He asked her questions. She answered them with the confidence of a 7-year-old who had spent 4 hours in an institution that confirmed everything she already believed. The plaque said they probably had feathers, she told him, pointing at the handout as supporting evidence. Probably means they're not sure, but I think they definitely did. What makes you think that? Because it makes sense, she said, with the magnificent circular logic of a child who hasn't yet been told that making sense isn't sufficient evidence. Birds came from dinosaurs. Birds have feathers. So, that's actually the right reasoning, he said. She looked at him with the particular satisfaction of someone who had been right and now had an adult confirming it. I know. He watched her eating her dinner and talking about velociraptors, and he felt something that he didn't have a word for exactly, a kind of fullness that wasn't happiness in any lightweight sense of the word, more like the deep, quiet satisfaction of being exactly where you intended to be. He'd felt it before. It came in small moments, usually, not in grand ones. He thought about whether a different job would change this, whether an office 11 blocks from the hotel and a salary that would remove certain monthly calculations from his life would alter the texture of evenings like this one. He thought it wouldn't, and he thought it might. And he didn't know for certain, which was the most honest thing he could say about it. After Maisie was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and wrote 2 columns. He didn't label them pros and cons because he'd always found that framing reductive, It implied that decisions were arithmetic, that you totaled one side and compared it to the other, and the bigger number won. Decisions about your own life didn't work that way. They were more like finding out which version of the future you were already leaning toward, and then being honest about whether the lean was coming from somewhere good. On the left side, he wrote, predictable hours, confirmed, the behavioral work is real and needed, Halden would improve, financial relief. On the right side, he wrote, it's hers, not mine. And then, does Maisie need more money or more of me present? He looked at the right side for a while. Then he added, under the first entry, the hotel is mine right now. He put the notepad down. He already knew, and he'd already known in the garden, and the columns weren't changing anything except confirming what he'd been leaning toward before he wrote the first word. He'd give her the answer tomorrow, which was Friday, which was within the window he'd committed to. He turned off the kitchen light. He arrived at the hotel at 6:45 on Friday morning, which was 5 minutes earlier than usual. Not intentionally. He just hadn't been able to sleep past 5:30, which happens sometimes, and he decided to get in early rather than lie there cataloging the ceiling. Dawn was already in, as he usually was. The facility's office light was on, and through the window Gavin could see Dawn at his desk with coffee and a printout of the day's work orders, making marks in the margins the way he always did, which was a planning system that made complete sense to Dawn and to nobody else. Gavin knocked. Come in. He sat in the chair across from Dawn's desk. Dawn looked up. You look like you didn't sleep much, Dawn said. I slept enough. Uh-huh. Dawn set down his pen. You want to talk about what Marlowe's people have been discussing, or do you want to keep not talking about it? Gavin looked at him. How do you know what Marlowe's people have been discussing? Because Sharon Yee, her communications director, called me yesterday to ask protocol questions about employee transitions, Dawn said, not unkindly. She was professional about it, but she called me. Gavin sat with that for a moment. She's efficient. From what I can tell, the whole operation runs that way. Dawn picked up his coffee. What are you going to tell her? That I appreciate it, and I'm going to stay. Dawn looked at him over the rim of his cup. He didn't say anything immediately. He had the manner of a man who was genuinely trying to assess whether this decision warranted an argument. Can I ask why? He said finally. Because the job she's offering is good, and I don't want it. Gavin paused, looking for the right words and finding them without too much difficulty. I built something here. It's not glamorous and it doesn't pay well, and the carpet in the service corridors is ugly. But I built it around the life I want to have, and changing it because something more impressive came along isn't a reason. It's just friction. Dawn was quiet for a moment. Maisie? He said. She's part of it, Gavin said. Not all of it. Dawn set down his cup. He looked out the small office window at the service corridor, which was in fact carpeted in the same institutional beige as the rest of the building's back-of-house areas. Then he looked back at Gavin. Okay, he said. Okay? Yeah. Dawn picked up his pen again. You've got a busted towel bar on 9 and a lobby HVAC filter that's been flagged for replacement. The filter should have been done Tuesday, but we got backed up. Gavin stood. I'll start with the filter. That'd be my choice too. Dawn made a mark on his printout. Rourke. He looked back from the doorway. For what it's worth, Dawn said, I think you're making the right call. He didn't look up from his paperwork when he said it. Now go fix the filter. He called Celeste at 11:17. She answered on the second ring, which told him she'd been expecting the call and had her phone where she could reach it. Gavin. I told you before Friday, he said. It's still Friday. I know. A pause. You're going to say no. Yes, he said. A longer pause. Not angry, more like someone finding their balance on unexpected ground. Can I ask why? She said. Because it's a good offer and I don't need it, he said. I know what that sounds like. It sounds like someone who knows exactly what they want, she said, quietly, without the professional polish she usually deployed, which I find I'm not used to. He thought about how to say the rest of it in a way that was honest without being unkind. You built the offer around what I value, he said. That was thoughtful. The problem is that what I value is the thing I already have. Not the shape of the job you described, the actual thing, the predictability of this building, The way my day ends and I know exactly where I'm going and who I'm going home to. He paused. I worked for a long time in an industry where what you did every day was absorb uncertainty on other people's behalf. There's a cost to that, even when you're good at it. I chose out of it deliberately, and taking a version of it back, even a controlled version, isn't something I want to do. She was quiet on the other end. The role I described isn't protective work, she said, but her voice had the quality of someone testing an argument they're not entirely convinced by. It's adjacent to it, he said, and I know the difference from the inside. Another pause. Okay. She said it the same way he'd said it to her in the meeting room. Clean, no layering. I'll say this, he added. Halden asked me to look at his protocol redesign. I'll do that, informally, on my own time. Not as an employee arrangement, just because it's the right thing to do and I can help him build something better. He heard something shift on her end of the line. You'd do that without a contract? I do that because it matters, he said. A better protocol means the next catering employee who acts wrong gets identified before they're 3 feet from a stage. That's worth doing regardless of whether there's a line item for it. She was quiet for a moment that felt like genuine processing, not performance. You're a strange man, Gavin Rourke, she said. The same word she'd used in the meeting room 2 days ago, but landing differently now. Less like observation, more like something approaching admiration. Probably, he agreed. I'm going to make you one other offer, she said. You don't have to say yes or no right now. You can just think about it. Okay. My foundation does security consultation for nonprofits and smaller organizations that can't afford proper protection infrastructure. It's separate from the corporate operation. All volunteer, no compensation, maybe 8 to 10 hours a month. I'm trying to build a network of people who know what they're doing, who are willing to consult. She paused. It wouldn't change your job or your schedule. It would just be people using what they know to help people who need it. Gavin was quiet for a moment. That's a different question, he said. I know. Send the details to my personal email. I'll look at them. I'll have Sharon send them today. All right. Another beat of quiet, then, how is she? Celeste asked. Maisie. The question was unexpected enough that he took a second before answering. She's 7, he said. She thinks velociraptors definitely had feathers. A small pause. She sounds right. She is, he said. Usually. He heard something in Celeste's end of the line. Not quite a laugh. Softer than that. The sound of a person who is trying to figure out how to end a conversation that has been more real than she'd anticipated. Thank you for calling, she said. You didn't have to. You could have sent a message. I said I'd give you an answer, he said. That should happen in person or as close to it as possible. I'm learning that you mean what you say, she said. Most people do, he said. It's just that not everyone means things that matter. He ended the call. He was standing outside the lobby-level HVAC access panel, which he'd opened but not yet worked on. He looked at the filter. It was dusty in the specific way of things that have been doing their job quietly for longer than they should and are now slightly overtaxed. He pulled on his work gloves and got to it. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to the service corridor on the 3rd floor. Gavin was coming back from the supply room with a replacement toilet flush mechanism for room 312. When he nearly walked into Tanner, who was standing outside the facilities office with his hands in his jacket pockets and the expression of a man who has been waiting for something unpleasant, and has been waiting for long enough that the anticipation has moved past anxiety into a kind of flat resignation. Gavin stopped. Tanner was 51, had been with the hotel's security team for 9 years, and was the kind of man who executed his responsibilities competently without ever developing the instinct that would have made him exceptional. He wasn't lazy, he wasn't careless, he just operated within the boundaries of what he'd been asked to do and rarely looked beyond them. In a different situation, that would have been fine. On Tuesday morning, in the Meridian corridor, it had left a gap that someone else had to cover. Rourke, Tanner said. Hey, Tanner. Tanner shifted his weight slightly. He looked at the wall beside Gavin's head rather than directly at him, which was the body language of someone who wanted to say something that required more directness than they currently had available. I've been thinking about what happened Tuesday, Tanner said. Gavin waited. The hire date thing. Tanner stopped. Tried again. I should have asked that question. You asked me to follow up, and He stopped again. I'd cleared the badge, and I thought that was enough, He exhaled. It wasn't enough. And I knew you were flagging it for a reason, and I still treated it like a formality. The badge clearing is a reasonable stopping point, Gavin said, under normal circumstances. These weren't normal circumstances. I know. You knew, Tanner said, and you told me. He finally looked at Gavin directly. If something had happened, if you hadn't gone back in there, that's a thing I'd have to carry. Gavin looked at him. He thought about what to say and how to say it, because Tanner wasn't asking for absolution. He was asking for something more specific, and Gavin needed to figure out what it was before he responded. Did anything change, he asked, in how you're going to work this going forward? Tanner blinked. Yeah, it did. Halden's redoing the protocol. I'm part of that working group, and He paused. I've been doing this job for 9 years, and I realized I've been checking credentials instead of checking people. That's a habit I'm going to break. Then you got what you needed out of it, Gavin said. Tanner looked at him. That's it? What else were you expecting? Tanner seemed to be genuinely unsure. He had come, Gavin suspected, with a script for a harder conversation, one where Gavin might be cold or accusatory or graciously forgiving in the way that made the person being forgiven feel worse, because the grace underscored how badly they'd failed. He hadn't come prepared for this, factual, brief, already looking forward. I thought you'd be... I don't know, Tanner said. I let you down. You did your job as you understood it, Gavin said. Your understanding of it is changing. That's what's supposed to happen. He paused. I need to get to 312. You doing all right otherwise? Tanner blinked again. Yeah, he said. Yeah, I'm okay. Good. Gavin moved past him toward the elevator. See you around, Tanner. He heard Tanner say something behind him. Quiet, not directed at him, more like the man was exhaling words without meaning to. He didn't catch exactly what it was. He didn't press for it. Some things needed to be said into empty air. Shut. The week closed down around him the way weeks did. Not neatly, but with the ordinary accumulation of tasks completed and tasks deferred, and details that resolved themselves, and details that would require another look on Monday. On Friday evening, Gavin picked up Maisie from after-school care at 5:48, 12 minutes early, which Mrs. Aguilar noted with visible appreciation. And they drove home in a car that needed new wiper blades before the rainy season, which was a note he had been making to himself since September and kept deferring for reasons he couldn't entirely justify. Can I tell you something? Maisie said from the back seat. Yeah. Jalen said that his brother stopped breaking things. Gavin glanced at her in the rearview mirror. What changed? He said his brother started playing guitar, Maisie said. Like, he had all this mad, and now he puts it in the guitar instead of in the walls. She paused. Mrs. Petrakis says that's called a healthy outlet. She's right. Do you have a healthy outlet? He thought about it. You, he said. Mostly. She made a face in the mirror. I'm a person, not an outlet. Fair point, he said. I'll think about it. You should learn guitar, she said. I should learn guitar, he agreed, without any particular intention of learning guitar. She seemed satisfied by this and looked out the window. He thought about the week, all of it, stacked up. Tuesday morning and the cable connection and the man in the white jacket, the ballroom, Halden's face when he recalibrated, Celeste in the meeting room with her jacket off the chair, the garden, the columns on the notepad, the call this morning. He thought about what he'd told Celeste, that what he valued was the thing he already had. That was true. He'd meant it. He believed it in the way you believe things that you've arrived at through actual cost, not just considered them in the abstract. But he also knew, sitting in traffic on the way home to their apartment, with his daughter explaining that Gerald the elephant had been returned to active bedtime duty because she'd decided the shelf was too cold, that decisions didn't stay still, that the life he'd built around Maisie would keep changing shape as she changed, that someday she'd need him differently than she needed him now. He didn't think that someday was close, and he wasn't going to make decisions based on a future that hadn't arrived. But he held it. He let it exist in the back of his awareness, not with anxiety, just as information. The traffic light changed. He drove. Saturday morning, Gavin's phone buzzed at 9:12 with an email notification. Sharon Yi, as promised. The details on the Foundation's security consultation network. He read it at the kitchen table while Maisie watched a documentary about deep-sea creatures in the other room, which she was narrating along with, loudly, adding details that were not in the documentary but that she seemed to feel were implied. The Foundation program was what Celeste had described. Volunteer, low-time commitment, focused on helping smaller organizations build basic security and threat awareness infrastructure. The list of participating organizations included community health clinics, domestic violence shelters, 2 food bank networks, a youth arts center. He read through it twice. Then he typed a short reply to Sharon Yi. "I'm in. Send me whatever orientation materials you have and a point of contact for scheduling." He sent it before he second-guessed the wording, which was how he made most decisions, quickly, once he'd thought about them long enough. He put his phone down. In the other room, Maisie was informing the anglerfish on screen that its light was, in her assessment, actually quite beautiful, which was a thing anglerfish probably didn't need to hear, but also didn't have a mechanism for objecting to. Gavin stood up and refilled his coffee. He looked around the apartment, the drawings on the refrigerator, Gerald reinstated on the bed pillow, the dinosaur handout from the museum still on the counter, the window with the morning light coming through it at the specific angle it came through at this time of year. He thought about Dana sometimes when the light was like this. Not with the sharp-edged grief of the early years, which had been like walking into furniture in the dark. More like the acknowledgement of an absence that had become integrated, always there, always real, no longer requiring him to stop moving in order to feel it. He thought she'd have had opinions about this week. Strong ones, probably, delivered with the particular mix of directness and humor that he'd loved about her and still, in certain quiet moments, missed with a specificity that nothing softened completely. She'd have had opinions about the toolbox and the ballroom and Celeste Marlowe and the East Garden bench. She'd have said something that made him laugh and then made him think, in that order. And then she'd have asked what he was having for dinner, as if the profound and the practical deserved equal attention. He thought she'd have agreed with his answer. He thought she might have suggested the guitar, actually. He carried his coffee to the living room doorway and leaned against the frame. On screen, a bioluminescent jellyfish drifted in water so dark it looked like space, trailing light from its edges. "That one doesn't have a brain," Maisie told it, informatively. "But it still knows what to do." Gavin looked at his daughter sitting cross-legged on the floor, her socked feet tucked under her knees, completely absorbed in something she found beautiful and was narrating to because narrating was how she processed the world. He stayed in the doorway. He didn't say anything. Some moments didn't need commentary. They just needed you to be there for them, entirely, without something else pulling at the edge of your attention. He was there. That was the whole of it. The following Tuesday, the Ashford Crown hosted a smaller event, a private lunch for 30 guests, no stage, no investor panels, just a catered meal in the second-floor Langham room for a regional banking consortium. Nothing that required special preparation or elevated security presence. A routine event in a hotel full of routine events. Gavin was on the 4th floor replacing a shower drain cover when Dawn's voice came through the radio. "Rourke, when you're done up there, building management wants a walkthrough on the east stairwell lighting, 3rd to 7th. Some of the motion sensors are cycling slow. Copy, 20 minutes. He finished the drain cover, a simple job, the kind that required more patience than skill, and packed his kit. On his way to the stairwell, he passed the door to the Langham room, where the lunch event was already underway. Through the door's narrow window, he could see the caterers moving between tables with practiced efficiency, white jackets, silver trays, the same choreography as any event day. He looked at the catering staff the way he always looked at people now, which was to say, the way he'd always looked at people, except that he'd stopped pretending he could turn it off. One server near the window was laughing at something a guest had said, genuinely laughing, head tilted back. 2 others were managing a cart near the service door with the slightly harried energy of people running 2 minutes behind. A 4th was standing near the wall doing nothing in particular. Gavin watched the 4th one for about 4 seconds. Then the man reached up and scratched the back of his neck, looked at his watch, and walked toward the kitchen door with the specific posture of someone who needed to retrieve something. Nothing. Just a person doing a job. Gavin moved on. He didn't feel relief when the read came back clean. He didn't feel anything about it particularly. It was just a room he'd looked into, and an assessment he'd made, and a door he'd passed. That was what this was now. Not a burden, not a mission, just a habit that lived in him like any other habit formed over years of necessity. The east stairwell lighting took the better part of an hour. 3 of the motion sensors were factory set to an overly conservative cycle time, which was a programming issue rather than a hardware one, and required the building automation tablet that Dawn kept in the facilities office. Gavin spent 40 minutes with the tablet resetting threshold parameters on each sensor while climbing and descending the stairwell with enough deliberate, unhurried movement to trigger and re-trigger the lights until the cycle times looked right. He was on the 6th floor landing, midway through the last adjustment, when his phone buzzed. A text from a number he now had saved, Celeste. The summit write-up ran this morning in the Financial Observer. The security incident is mentioned. Your name is not in it. Wanted you to know directly. He read it. Typed back. Appreciated. Thank you. 3 dots appeared. Then, Sharon forwarded your response about the foundation program. We're glad to have you. He pocketed the phone and went back to the sensor adjustment. The write-up in the Financial Observer was something Dawn mentioned over coffee Wednesday morning. Not because it had anything to do with hotel operations, but because Dawn had read it and had thoughts. They called it a security incident involving a credentialing breach that was swiftly contained by the event's protection team, Dawn said, reading from his phone screen. Protection team. He set the phone down. Your maintenance. That's accurate, Gavin said. You're not bothered by that? Gavin looked at him. Should I be? Dawn made the face of a man who is deciding whether to push something. Most people would be, getting written out of their own story. It's not my story, Gavin said. It's a security incident report dressed up as journalism. I'm not in it because I asked not to be in it. That's how that works. Dawn drank his coffee. He had the look of a man who understood the logic and found it personally unsatisfying on someone else's behalf. Still. Dawn, Gavin said, I need my kid to be able to go to school without her classmates knowing her dad disarmed someone. She's 7. She doesn't need that as part of her world right now. Dawn was quiet for a moment. Then, yeah, okay. That's the math, Gavin said. I know, Dawn said. I just think sometimes you deserve credit you never take. Gavin finished his coffee. I get paid by the hour. The credit goes on the timesheet. He stood. What's the priority list today? Dawn picked up his work orders with the mild exasperation of a man who has lost an argument he wasn't trying to win. Elevator 3 is making a noise nobody can describe accurately, which means it could be anything. Start there. The elevator took until noon. The noise, which various guests had described variously as a hum, a click, a low vibration, and in one case a feeling more than a sound, turned out to be a worn guide shoe on the left rail causing micro-drag at specific floor intervals. Gavin identified it by riding the elevator alone for 20 minutes, which was exactly as tedious as it sounds, then confirmed it with an inspection of the rail system, and replaced the shoe with a colleague named Marcus, who had been with the hotel longer than anyone except Dawn, and who approached every maintenance job with the same combination of low-grade complaining and genuine competence. These old Otis systems, Marcus said, lying on his back in the elevator pit looking at the rail assembly. They run forever and then they give you something weird. It's always the guide shoes with this model, Gavin said. I didn't know that. You do now. Marcus handed up a bolt and looked at Gavin from his position on the pit floor. He had a way of looking at people from angles, from below, from the side, that somehow always managed to be direct anyway. Hey, so I heard something. Probably. I heard Marlowe's people were looking at you for a position. Where did you hear that? Linda in guest services. She heard it from the guy at the front desk who heard it from Petra, who is apparently not as discreet as her job might suggest. Gavin kept working on the shoe replacement. And you said no, Marcus said. It wasn't a question. I said no. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Good, he said. Gavin looked down at him. Good? Good, Marcus repeated. Because if you left, I'd have to break in a new guy on the elevator systems, and this hotel has 11 of them, and 3 are geriatric. That's a very self-interested reason. I'm a very self-interested man, Marcus said cheerfully. Hand me the torque wrench. The week moved through its ordinary hours. Gavin fixed things. He picked up Maisie. He made dinner. He sat at the kitchen table after she went to bed and reviewed the foundation's orientation materials that Sharon had sent. 20 pages covering the participating organizations, the consultation framework, the available resources, the contact protocol for the volunteer network. He read it the way he read everything important, carefully, once all the way through for the shape, then again for the details. The work was real. He could see that immediately. Not polished corporate document real, but actually needs doing real. One of the domestic violence shelters had a staff of 6 and received threats on a semi-regular basis from former partners of women in their program, and their current security protocol was essentially a locked front door and a phone tree. A youth arts center in the downtown corridor had had 2 incidents of after-hours vandalism that the police report categorized as property crime, but that read to Gavin, in the pattern and timing, as targeted harassment. He wrote back to Sharon with 3 questions about the shelter's physical layout and a request for the police report on the arts center incidents. Sharon responded within an hour. The layout information would take a day to gather, but she was attaching the police report now. He read the report. He had some thoughts. He wrote them down and sent them to the email address listed as the Foundation's security consultation intake, a different person, a woman named Reyes, who handled the program coordination. He explained who he was, how he'd been connected to the program, and what he'd noticed in the incident pattern. Reyes wrote back the next morning, "Mr. Rourke, this is exactly the kind of analysis we've been hoping to get from someone with your background. Would you be available for a call Thursday at noon?" He checked his work schedule. He had a lunch break. "Yes," he wrote. "Noon works." Yet Thursday came. The call with Reyes lasted 45 minutes. She was precise and unhurried and had the quality of someone who had been trying to solve a problem with insufficient tools for long enough that encountering the right tool produced a calm, immediate focus rather than excitement. They talked about the Arts Center incidents. He walked her through the pattern analysis, timing, location, escalation sequence, the difference between opportunistic vandalism and someone who knew the building's schedule. She asked questions that were good questions. He answered them as thoroughly as he could and flagged the 2 things he'd need more information to address. "I want to be clear about something," she said near the end of the call. "Our resources are limited. We can't implement anything complex." "I know," he said. "I'm not going to give you complex. Complex fails at the execution stage when the people executing it are already stretched." He paused. "Simple things done consistently are harder to defeat than complicated things done inconsistently. That's the principle." "That sounds like something worth putting in the orientation materials," she said. "Feel free." He heard her typing. Then, "Can I ask, what made you say yes to this? Most people with your level of experience aren't looking for volunteer work with nonprofits." He thought about it. "Because the people in that shelter have a real problem, and I can see it clearly enough to help with it," he said. "That combination doesn't come along all the time. When it does, it seems wasteful not to." Reyes was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to tell you that we have 7 other organizations waiting for someone to look at their situations. I'm not saying that to pressure you." "I know you're not," he said. "Send me the files. I'll work through them when I can." Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "I might look at the files and tell you the situations don't have good solutions. Sometimes they don't." "That's still useful information," Reyes said. He acknowledged that and ended the call. He was sitting in the staff break room on the 2nd floor, which was an uninspiring space with a vending machine that reliably got things stuck and a table that wobbled unless you put a folded napkin under the short leg. He sat there for another few minutes after the call ended, looking at the middle distance. He thought about what he'd told Reyes, that the combination of having the knowledge and seeing a clear need didn't come along all the time. That was true. What he hadn't said, because she hadn't asked and it wasn't information she needed, was that doing this kind of work through the Foundation felt different than doing it at the level he'd done it before. Before, the work had been about proximity, being physically present between a threat and a person, absorbing risk on someone else's behalf at close range. That work had been his, and he'd been good at it, and he didn't regret the years he'd spent in it. But this was different. This was giving the knowledge away, building it into other people's practices and procedures so that when he wasn't there, which was always in these organizations because he was a volunteer with a maintenance job and a 7-year-old, the shape of his thinking was still present in how the lock was positioned, how the staff were trained to read a situation, which door got the secondary sensor. He wasn't sure which kind of work mattered more. He suspected the answer was that the question itself was wrong, that both things had their use and their cost and their moment, and the job was just figuring out which one the moment required. The break room vending machine hummed. The table wobbled when he put his elbow on it, then steadied. He went back to work. 2 weeks after the summit, Gavin received a letter. Not an email, an actual letter, on heavy cream paper, in an envelope with the Marlowe Capital logo embossed on the back flap. It arrived at the hotel's facilities office addressed to him personally, which was unusual enough that Dawn held it up when Gavin came in Wednesday morning with a look of genuine curiosity. "You're getting correspondence now," Dawn said. Gavin took the envelope. He opened it at the counter while Dawn pretended to look at work orders. The letter was handwritten, not in the way of someone who had been told that handwritten letters were more personal and had performed the gesture accordingly, in the way of someone who had actually sat down and written something out because they needed the slowness of it, the physicality of choosing words when you can't delete them. It was 2 pages. He read it standing at the counter. Celeste wrote about the summit, about the prepared speech she'd abandoned in the second afternoon session, how she'd stood in front of 200 people and told them that she'd spent the previous morning being corrected about the nature of expertise by a man she'd dismissed without looking at him, and that the lesson in that was one she intended to spend considerable time with. She wrote that several people came to her afterward, not to discuss the emerging markets panel or the Q4 projections, but to tell her that what she'd said in that departure from her script was the most useful thing they'd heard at a business conference in years. She wrote that she didn't think of herself as someone who needed to be humbled. She'd have said, before Tuesday, that she was self-aware and open to correction. She'd written that sentence and then crossed it out. He could see the line through it, and rewritten it. "I thought I was those things, but I had built a very efficient system for avoiding the moments that would actually test whether they were true." She wrote about her father, just briefly, without a lot of detail, that he'd grown up working in a steel distribution company, that he'd built it into something substantial, and that for most of her childhood she'd watched him judge people by what they controlled and what they'd accumulated, and that she'd spent her adult life believing she'd corrected for that bias, while in fact she'd just learned to do it more quickly and with more sophisticated language. She wrote, "You didn't give me a lesson. I don't think you were trying to. You were just being exactly who you are." That turned out to be sufficient. She wrote that she hoped Maisie's field trip had been good, and that the feathered velociraptor theory was, in her understanding, increasingly well supported by the paleontological record. She signed it with her first name only. No title, no company affiliation. Gavin read it twice. He folded it along its original creases and put it back in the envelope. "Good news?" Dawn asked, still pretending to look at work orders. "Yeah," Gavin said. "Good news." He put the letter in his jacket pocket. He'd decide what to do with it later, whether to keep it somewhere, or whether keeping it was the kind of thing that attached too much significance to a moment that was better held lightly. He didn't know yet. Some things you had to carry for a while before you knew what they were for. "Elevator 9 is making a sound," Dawn said. "What kind of sound?" Dawn looked at the complaint log. The guest described it as ominous. "That's not a technical description." "No," Dawn agreed, "but it's evocative." Gavin picked up his toolbox. He thought about the letter on the drive home that evening. He thought about what Celeste had written, about the system she'd built for avoiding tests of her own self-image, and how that system had been sophisticated enough to fool her for years. He thought about how that wasn't unusual. Most people built versions of that system. The materials varied: status, certainty, the comfort of surrounding yourself with people who reflected your assumptions back without friction. The architecture was broadly the same. He thought about his own version of it. He'd spent the years since Dana died telling himself he'd made a clean choice, that he'd chosen Maisie clearly and without residue, that the career he'd left hadn't left anything in him that needed tending to. And that was mostly true. He had chosen clearly. He did live without significant regret about it. But there was a version of the clean choice that was also a way of not asking certain questions. Whether he was lonely in ways he hadn't admitted. Whether the deliberate smallness of his life, which he'd framed as intentional and meaningful, and which was also, in some corner of it, a form of self-protection. Whether staying in the smallest possible footprint meant he never had to risk the things that mattered to him. He didn't have clean answers to those questions. He suspected that was appropriate, that the absence of clean answers meant he was asking them honestly, rather than performing the inquiry and arriving at a predetermined conclusion. He was 32. Maisie was 7. The life ahead of them was long and would keep changing shape. He could hold the questions. He was good at holding things. Maisie was in the back seat, quiet for once. She'd had a long day involving a disagreement with her best friend about something he'd only partially gotten to the bottom of, and the disagreement had left her in the slightly interior mood that meant she was processing something and would tell him about it when she'd finished processing, which might be tonight or might be 3 days from now. He didn't push it. "Hey," he said. She looked up in his mirror. "You know you can tell me things when you're ready, right? There's no deadline on it." She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. Then, "Chloe said something mean and then said she was joking, but she wasn't joking." "How do you know she wasn't joking?" "Because when people are actually joking, they look different than when they're saying something mean and calling it a joke," Maisie said, with the blunt perceptiveness of someone who had not yet learned to doubt her own observations. He felt something move in his chest. "You're right," he said. "There is a difference." "I know." She looked back out the window. "I'm not mad at her anymore. I just need to think about whether I trust her the same way." He drove. The streetlights were coming on, the early dark of autumn settling over the city in its gradual way. "That's a very mature thing to think about," he said. "Mrs. Petrakis says trust is built in small things and broken in small things," Maisie said, "and that the big moments just show you what was already true." He was quiet for a moment. He thought about Tanner in the service corridor, about Halden's hand extended in the morning, about a cream-colored envelope in his jacket pocket. "Mrs. Petrakis is smart," he said. "Very," Maisie agreed, with the authority of someone who had access to primary sources on the matter. The Ashford crown settled into autumn, the way old buildings do, not with any single visible change, but with a gradual accumulation of small adjustments. The heating system came back online in October and required 3 days of Gavin's attention to coax into its seasonal rhythm without the pressure fluctuations that had plagued the previous winter. The lobby floral arrangements shifted to deep oranges and rust. The Japanese maple in the east courtyard finally turned, which Gavin noticed one morning on his way through and stopped for approximately 30 seconds to look at. He sent a photo of it to Celeste. No message, just the photo. She wrote back 4 minutes later. "I'd forgotten about that tree." He didn't write back to that. He pocketed his phone and went to check on the heating system. The foundation work had settled into a rhythm too, roughly 10 hours a month, as Reyes had described, sometimes more when a specific situation required focused attention. He'd completed assessments for 3 of the 7 organizations she'd sent files on. One of them, a community health clinic in the Eastern District, had a situation complex enough that he'd asked Reyes if Halden's team could do a site walkthrough, and Reyes had said she'd ask, and Halden had said yes without being asked twice. And so Gavin and Halden had spent a Saturday morning walking a community health clinic's floor plan together with cups of terrible vending machine coffee and the specific professional shorthand of 2 people who understood the same things without needing to explain them. Halden was different in the field than he was in a professional setting. Less formal, more direct, more willing to say, "I don't know," when he didn't know, and ask a question when he needed an answer. Gavin found he liked him in an unadorned way, not warmly, exactly, but with the steady appreciation of someone who recognized competence and honesty in combination. "You enjoy this?" Halden asked at one point, standing in the clinic's back corridor near the staff-only exit, making notes on the layout in a small book he kept in his jacket pocket. "The assessment work?" "The whole thing. The maintenance job, this." Halden gestured in a way that encompassed the corridor and the clinic and the 10 hours a month and the toolbox that was sitting near the door. "The scale of it." Gavin thought about it honestly, which was the only way he thought about it. "Yeah," he said, "I do." "It doesn't feel small to you." "It is small," Gavin said. "That's different from feeling small." He looked at the exit door, checking the hinge alignment. Slightly misaligned, which meant the door would resist a fast exit under stress, which was a problem in a clinic where fast exits sometimes mattered. He made a note. "I spent 6 years working at the largest possible scale of this. Every client was important, every threat was significant, Every assignment carried genuine stakes. He paused. I wasn't wrong that it mattered. I was wrong that the scale was what made it matter. Halden looked at him. What makes it matter? Whether it's real, Gavin said. Whether the thing you're protecting is actually worth protecting and the reason you're doing it is true. The rest is, he shrugged, the rest is just the frame. Halden was quiet for a moment. He looked at his notepad. He looked at the door with its slightly misaligned hinge. I've been in this work for 11 years, he said slowly, and I don't think anyone has ever said that to me directly. Someone might have, Gavin said. You might not have been ready to hear it yet. Halden considered this without defensiveness. Maybe, he said. They finished the walkthrough. They wrote up the recommendations. The clinic director, a small energetic woman named Dr. Paxton, who had been running the facility on borrowed time and resourcefulness for 9 years, listened to their findings with the concentration of someone who was going to implement every actionable item and had already mentally assigned the tasks before they'd finished speaking. The door hinge, she said when they mentioned it. Simple fix, Gavin said. I can do it now if you have 20 minutes and a screwdriver. She looked at him, then at Halden, then back at him. You came to do a security assessment and you're offering to fix my door hinge. I have the tools in my truck, he said. It'll take 15 minutes. Dr. Paxton shook her head slowly, with the expression of someone adjusting their expectations in real time. All right, she said. Yes, please. He fixed the door hinge. Halden held the flashlight. On the way out, Halden said very quietly, I want you to know that I'm going to be telling that story for a while. It's a door hinge, Gavin said. It's a door hinge fixed by a man who 2 weeks ago redirected me into a row of event chairs without injuring me, Halden said, and who turned down a 6-figure position because he prefers to fix door hinges. Forgive me for finding it notable. Gavin unlocked his truck. Get some sleep, Halden. Halden walked toward his own car. He was almost to it when he called back without turning around. Same to you, Rourke. Maisie resolved the situation with Chloe on a Thursday, approximately 9 days after it started, which was in Gavin's estimation about the right amount of time for a 7-year-old to process a trust recalibration. She reported the resolution over dinner with the concise satisfaction of someone filing a closed case. I told her that when she says something mean, she should just say it was mean instead of saying it was a joke, Maisie said. And she said okay, and then we were fine. That's it, Gavin said. That's it, Maisie confirmed. Sometimes things are complicated, and sometimes they're just, you say the true thing and then it's done. He looked at his daughter across the kitchen table, at her matter-of-fact expression and her half-eaten dinner and the remnants of what she'd drawn in class that day, still visible as a faint pencil smudge on the side of her hand. That's exactly right, he said. She accepted this and returned to her dinner. He thought about what Mrs. Petrakis had said. Trust built and broken in small things, the big moments just showing what was already true. He thought about Tuesday morning in the Meridian corridor, about a flickering display panel and a faded uniform, and a woman who had sorted him into a category without looking at him carefully enough. About all the things that had followed from that, the chain of moments, each one specific and unglamorous and real. The big moments showed what was already true. That was right. He hadn't become something different in the Meridian ballroom. He'd just been the thing he already was, in a situation that made it visible. That was the only honest account of it. He didn't know if Celeste was still thinking about what she'd written in that letter. He suspected that it had been the kind of writing that you do because the thinking behind it hasn't finished yet, and you need somewhere to put it. He hoped the thinking led her somewhere useful, not because she owed him anything. She didn't, or they were square, or the ledger was the wrong framework entirely, but because people who were genuinely trying to understand something deserved to get there. Even people who'd been careless before they started trying. Especially those people. He washed the dishes. Maisie dried them, badly, in the way she always dried them, leaving water traces that she considered close enough to dry. He let it go. Some things weren't worth the instruction. He got her ready for bed. She asked him to read 3 chapters of the Webster book, which was 2 more than their usual agreement, and he read 2 chapters and negotiated the 3rd down to 1 additional page, which she accepted as a reasonable compromise and was asleep before the page was finished. He turned off her lamp. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Gerald the elephant was back on the pillow where he belonged. Gavin went to the kitchen and sat at the table. He took the letter out of his jacket pocket. Still there, still folded along its original creases, and read it one more time. The last line, "You were just being exactly who you are." That turned out to be sufficient. He folded it again. He put it in the kitchen drawer where he kept things that didn't have a specific home, but that he wasn't ready to throw away. Take-out menus from places he'd liked. Maisie's first attempt at writing her own name in letters that were going in 5 different directions. A photograph of Dana at a beach they'd gone to in their second year together, where she was squinting into the sun and laughing at something just out of frame. He put the letter in there and closed the drawer. Then he sat at the table in the quiet apartment with his hands around an empty coffee cup, and he didn't think about anything in particular for a little while. Not the foundation files, not the elevator on 9 that was still being intermittently ominous, not the questions he'd been carrying about the shape of his life and where it was going. Just the sound of the building settling and the streetlight through the window, and his daughter asleep in the other room. He was 32 years old. He carried a toolbox through hotel corridors for a living. He was raising a child who corrected anglerfish documentaries and dried dishes badly and understood, at 7, that saying the true thing was sometimes enough. He was not finished becoming who he was going to be. He knew that. The questions he'd been sitting with, about loneliness, about the size of the life he'd built, about what he might want when Maisie was older and needed him differently, those questions would keep asking themselves, and he would keep trying to answer them honestly, and some of the answers would surprise him, and some would confirm what he already suspected, and some he would get wrong and have to revise. That was fine. That was what it was to be alive and paying attention. He was, above most things, paying attention. He rinsed his cup. He turned off the kitchen light. He went to bed. Tomorrow was Friday, and Maisie had early drop-off, and the elevator on 9 was still making a noise that nobody had described accurately, and there was work to do. There was always work to do. That too